Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about an issue central to the future of our country, reconciliation. The challenges facing Indigenous Canadians and the relationship with our country and how we can all move forward together has understandably taken on increasing political importance in recent years. And to talk about it, I'm pleased to be joined by Karen Restoule, CEO of Shared Value Solutions, former alternate executive chair of Tribunals Ontario, and a proud member of the Doukas First Nation in Northern Ontario. Karen, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
So Karen, I wanted to start perhaps by asking you a bit about your own life story. You've actually accomplished an astonishing amount in such a short time. So can you maybe trace your career path a bit for us?
For sure. For starters, I think it's important for folks to understand that I'm from Doukas First Nation, which is a small but very mighty community that has long prioritized its economy and as a result enjoyed a very strong social fabric. And that is at the root of who I am and of who we all are as peoples from Doukas Bay. In the early 80s, my dad moved our family to Sudbury. It was important for him to ensure that my brothers and I had opportunities that just weren't afforded to him as a kid growing up on the reserve in the 60s and 70s. And so I think it's really that point of connection and opportunity that allowed me, I would say, the courage and confidence and bravery to move away from Sudbury after high school to attend the University of Toronto for my undergrad. From there, I spent 4 years in the criminal justice system as a victim rights advocate, working in the restorative justice systems as a probation officer back in Northern Ontario. And that really gave me a thirst to expand my understanding of the legal framework in this country to get a better sense of, what guides our country, the decision making, and what policies influence my life as a northern girl, but also as an Indigenous person in Canada. And that gave way to a career in policy at the Chiefs of Ontario, serving First Nations leadership, and also from there, as you mentioned, I was at Tribunals Ontario, leading Ontario's administrative justice system, fixing, tinkering, leading change, ensuring that we have a high standard of public service for the people of Ontario. So I was there for 6 years and doing Indigenous policy on the side of my desk, and decided this year in January to join Shared Value Solutions to shift my focus and provide some full-time, provide myself the opportunity to focus on it full-time.
Wow, it's an impressive accomplishments already at this stage in your career. And we'll touch on some of the things that you'd already mentioned, I think, later on in the show. But, I want to just talk briefly about reconciliation generally. I think it's fair to say a lot of Canadians, they don't actually have a grasp of what it means, or they might think it just simply is about coming to terms with Canada's shameful history with respect to Indigenous Canadians. I wanted to ask, what does reconciliation mean to you personally?
To me, it means recognizing our past, our collective past, but ultimately, I see reconciliation as something that's tangible, something that we have to move the dial on. Some folks think it's, more of a romantic feel-good exercise, and I just think we have work to do. And I'd like to see everyone get on that bandwagon and work hard to move the dial. It's about finding initiatives, in my view, that impact the whole country, where we as Indigenous peoples and Canadians, where we align on vision and principles. And it's not to say that we can't honor that past, that we can't, face the truths and face the darker shades of our shared history. We can and we must do that. But most importantly, it's about taking action and making sure that we're making choices every day, taking action every day to build a better future for the next generations.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just an issue about the past; it's an issue about the future and where we go together. And I think there's a lot that we can unpack on this subject. We're going to take a very short break, and we're going to come back and continue talking with Karen Restoule, CEO of Shared Value Solutions, about reconciliation. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking reconciliation with Karen Restoule, CEO of Shared Value Solutions and member of the Doki's First Nation. Karen, over the course of your life, have you seen significant changes in terms of awareness about Indigenous issues and how dealing with them rank as political priorities for governments in Canada?
Yeah, I think we are definitely seeing progress from the political parties in terms of awareness and focus and consideration of Indigenous peoples and nations and issues, which is great. It's fantastic. I would say that some parties are better than others. Some are better at talking, some are better at doing. But what's important is that we're now at the forefront of that consciousness, which I think is a great place to be. And of course, we're going to, keep pushing the dialogue to ensure that these continue to be part of the conversation and discourse. In terms of general awareness, though, Aaron, like I love that I've seen, I love the increase in people's general awareness. But what I'd like to see more is a willingness to learn. Anyone can take the Indigenous 101 awareness course, eat the terrible catered sandwiches, and then hop on a bus to Orleans, light up the barbecue in their backyard, and forget about what they learned that day. But the willingness to learn, to process, to understand the story of Canada, how it came to be, but more importantly, giving thought to taking action to what they can do within their personal lives, within their working lives, to build a better Canada. That means engaging with each other on where we have been, where we are now, and what we can do moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wanted to ask about policy proposals. I think in a lot of cases, at least when it comes to non-Indigenous Canadians, a lot of the proposals often seem to amount to just simply providing more funding to Indigenous communities. Is helping improve the quality of life for Indigenous Canadians really just a matter of more funding? Is that really what is needed? Is that enough?
The financial amounts are required because the situation is so dire. And this, at this point, is not a secret. We all know that many communities continue to struggle with basics like clean drinking water, adequate infrastructure. And so I think at this point we need to question. We could look at the amounts that have been spent and question on what they've been spent on. And to
Right.
me, in my view, and these numbers are, as you know, are very hard to come by, where has the money been going? And why hasn't the dial moved? Because we're talking about, I think the last budget was over 8 billion, and then the feds keep adding, more and more money into it. And yet, when you talk to communities, life in First Nations really hasn't, shifted much with the extra expenditures. So it's about the system. The bureaucracy is getting a lot of those funds. We're feeding the machines, so to speak, and we're not putting the money where it matters most. And so we do have to, as a solution, correct the federal policy framework, which in my view is creating an avenue for the modern implementation of treaties, and so that we eventually don't need the Indian Act and we don't need, the entire bureaucratic machinery behind it, and all the investments can be focused on improving lives of First Nations people across the country.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a lot more about the Indian Act a little bit later in the show. I wanted to talk specifically about economic opportunities for Indigenous Canadians. What up until now, in your view, has been the problem, the challenge in ensuring that there are economic opportunities for Indigenous Canadians, and what needs to change going forward to improve the situation?
The sentiment that's been created by bad federal policy, namely the Indian Act, has led Canadians to believe that they can steamroll over Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations in this country. And so that's the approach that industry took for quite some time. And then eventually the courts intervened. Indigenous people rose up, went to the courts. The courts intervened and explained to Canadians that, the legal positioning and inherent rights of First Nations in this country. And then it shifted to consultation and engagement and eventually accommodation. Lately, we're seeing the principle of free, prior, and informed consent brought to us through the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has fundamentally shifted the conversation. And today, in light of conversations on ESG and sustainability, we're seeing, the dynamic shift to one of equity partnership, one where First Nations are at the driver's seat.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking reconciliation with Karen Restoule, CEO of Shared Value Solutions and member of the Doki's First Nation. Karen, we're going to talk about the Indian Act, which I know is an issue near and dear to your heart. I think we need to start at the sort of 10,000 foot level, though, because I think most Canadians, they have a vague awareness about what the Indian Act is, but not much more than that. So I guess if you could educate us, what is the Indian Act and why is it so important?
So this piece of legislation dates back to 1876. What people don't know is that it kind of married a bunch of ad hoc policies that the folks at the time who were governing on these lands amalgamated. Into one beautiful piece of legislation that, in my view, beautiful being sarcastic, of course, that in my view, over the years has done way more harm to us as a country than good. The original intent was to support the treaties that had been signed throughout the 1800s that worked to keep Indigenous people contained within specific borders so that they wouldn't get in the way of Western expansion efforts, and eventually, was amended and edited over a course of time. And in its current form today, in 2022, it has for objective to manage registered Indians, governments, and lands. So in my view, I don't know that it's achieved any of its objectives with seeing where things are where they are today. I think there's an opportunity to correct the course here and and do policy better.
Now, you're certainly not the first person to criticize the Indian Act. In fact, there seems to be criticism clear across the political spectrum about the Indian Act. As you say, it's been around almost as long as Canada has been around. So I guess the question is, why has there been no major reform to the Act in that period, especially if everyone can agree that the Act itself is a problem?
Well, it has served a purpose. And to some extent, it did allow for uninterrupted Western expansion. Did it succeed in assimilating every Indigenous person into the quote unquote Canadian fabric? I would argue no. But like you say, Aaron, the thing's been around for 146 years. Canada, in the state that we know it, has been around for 155 years, and it's a bit puzzling how we've been governing quote unquote Indigenous affairs with the same strategy for 146 years. I mean, even the Constitution has been revisited in 1982. So it's a bit of a head scratcher. Some thoughts, I think change is hard and scary, even if it means it's going to be for the better. I think the Act codifies, as I mentioned, treaties. And without a serious discussion on how to implement those treaties in the modern times, I don't know that there's an appetite yet to get rid of that Indian Act.
I see. So I guess I put to you then specifically, I mean, you must have some views on what a post-Indian Act relationship between Canada and Indigenous Canadians would look like. Do you have any sort of broad principles or things that you would like to see if we are able to ever move forward past the Indian Act?
Yeah, so it's actually more um, realistic and within reach than Canadians would like to think. When we look at what's going on in British Columbia, in the territories, throughout even to northern Quebec, there's some modern agreements that have been in place for quite some time that include 40 or so communities. And while these agreements are heavily criticized for not being perfect in the sense that they don't achieve sovereignty for those nations, I believe they are a step in the right direction, help to support self and local government, and they're definitely a step in the right direction. Now, the question is, what about the other 590 plus First Nation communities in the middle of the country? We're talking about pretty much a territorial span that covers, half of the country landmass. So it's pretty significant. These are treaties that are called named historic treaties, but as a beneficiary of Robinson Huron Treaty, I don't think it's historic at all. This treaty is still alive and well and continues to govern, quote unquote, secure my way of life, my community's way of life, and the way of life of other Canadians within this territory. So it's on the government, on the leaders of today and tomorrow, to set up a policy framework that allows for those negotiations to happen. What do these treaties look like in modern application, and how are we going to work together to implement them and respect them?
Yeah, great thoughts, Karen. We're going to take a very short break, and we're going to be back again after this short break. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking reconciliation with Karen Restoule, CEO of Shared Value Solutions and a member of the Doki's First Nation. Karen, we've been talking about the Indian Act and sort of the challenges in abolishing or reforming it. Given how long it's been and how difficult it has been to have major reform, I wanted to get your thoughts on whether you see what you see as the easier path forward for reform. Is it going to be a sort of big overhaul all in one piece of the Act, or is there going to be opportunity for individuals, sort of First Nations communities, to sort of take the lead and sort of blaze a trail that might make a sort of post-Act world more appealing to other First Nations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. People are often hesitant to ask the how, Aaron. So kudos to you for being brave enough to go there. Um, we are seeing leadership through Robinson Huron Treaty right now who've pursued, recognition of modern application of the rights protected by that treaty at federal court, and now sitting at negotiations tables with Canada and Ontario. So great to see that going, showing great leadership on that front, and might serve as a bit of a window as to how we can, move towards the modern application and implementation of these treaties. Now, when you ask, is it all or nothing? Is it a blockbuster situation? I'd like to think that it is, but generally in life, that's not how things work. But that's not to, there's value in an incremental approach, but that's not to say that we can't set goals for ourselves. It's not to say that we can't say by X year, let's say 2050, we can't, that we're towards having modern application of all treaties in this country, and, kick the Indian Act to the curb. We can maybe even be a bit more ambitious and say 40. But nonetheless, the point is here that we have to get started somewhere. And we need strong leadership in Ottawa who's bold enough and brave to take on this file to correct the course on the policy front. So Indigenous people in this country can be recognized for the great value that they contribute to this country.
Yeah, it sounds like obviously big steps are better, but a lot of baby steps can add up to big steps.
That's right.
If they actually continue. Circling back to the broad theme of reconciliation, I guess I wanted to ask whether or not you're an optimist about these things. Are things getting better? Do you see them continuing to get better?
I'm very encouraged to see where things are at. I think on the policy front, there's a bit, of fear, a bit of lack of, leadership, as we've covered with, in and around the policy, the modern application of the historic treaties. But on the economic front, I'm particularly encouraged to see some great advancements there, tons of alignment on vision and principles between industry, governments, First Nations. This has obviously been pushed on to Canadians through conversations around climate, sustainability, ESG factors. But we're finally seeing alignment on natural resource in this country, and seeing the opportunity through equitable and respectful partnership on that front, and a recognition that resource development projects are sourced from Indigenous territories, and that economic gain will really only be achieved through true and equitable partnerships. So it's quite exciting. If I can highlight a couple of examples, I think the work being done by the First Nations Major Project Coalition out west in BC, where we have First Nations leadership working with leading Indigenous policy minds, are really redefining the industry Indigenous relationship, and what's required there to help support a timely and expeditious transition to a more sustainable future. So I am closely watching them all the time. I love what's coming out of there, and then particularly encouraged by Conservatives for Clean Growth. Exceptional leadership coming from Lisa Raitt, Jim Dinning, Ken Bosenkool on this front, who are clearly defining the opportunities that lie ahead for everyone on climate targets and clean energy transition. So I think it's an exciting time for us.
Well, that's great to hear, Karen, and it's great to hear your optimism. It's a tough topic, and I think an uncomfortable topic for a lot of Canadians. But I think you give a lot of reason for hope and optimism, and I'm certainly glad that you could join us today.
Thanks so much, Aaron.
And thank you to the viewers for joining us today. We'll catch you again soon on Our Canada, Our Future.